Si algo realmente puede transformar a un país es la educación, de eso estoy absolutamente convencido. Lant Pritchett nos va a hablar de eso y después tenemos la sesión sobre la sesión de educación. Recibamos con un aplauso a Lant Pritchett.
Gracias.
Por favor, pónganse los audífonos los que no entiendan inglés.
Voy a empezar con un poco de español para agradecerles todo, para amadrugar, para el telonero, para Estrella de Ministro Saavedra que viene, pero yo voy a prepararles para los mensajes que él tiene. Entonces, hoy día quiero tomar en serio, and I'm going to switch into English and let our expert translator really speak Spanish. I want to talk about taking seriously the idea of Peru getting to first world in a generation, and argue that that's going to really require a rebirth of the notion of education. So, first, the good news. As a guest in your country, I figure I should begin with some pleasing news. There has, in fact, in Peru been tremendous progress in expanding the length of time kids are in school, and the number of kids are in school, and the socioeconomic equality within the school. So if we go back to a cohort of recent graduates in 1991, we see that particularly among the bottom 40th percentile, the red line, there was nearly every child started school, but this line traces out at what grade they drop out. And what you see is that only 22% of the children from the bottom 40% of households even completed grade 9 in Peru, even as recently as 20 years ago. So there was universal enrollment, but a lot of dropout, such that only 22% and only 15%, for instance, of a disadvantaged category like rural girls. You can see by 2012, there's just been a massive increase in the extent to which children stay in school of all classes. So nearly, even of the poor, nearly all children are completing primary school, and many of them are staying in such that the 56%, even of the poorest households, are finishing grade 9. So the good news is that on schooling, Peru has done a terrific job. The bad news is that no one ever really had a schooling goal. If you think about it, schooling is just how long butts stay in seats. It's just time served, right? What we really wanted was an education. What we really wanted is to prepare the youth of Peru to be adults, to be citizens, to be workers, to be mothers and fathers. We wanted them to have the competencies and skills to be effective adults. But in order for a schooling goal of time served to translate into an education goal of competencies acquired, there's something called a learning profile. You actually have to learn stuff from year to year to year, and it has to accumulate. And if that learning trajectory is just too flat, you can have lots of time in school and not actually have the youth of today prepared for their future of tomorrow. After all, if you think about a pure schooling goal of just time served, there's only one other social phenomena we measure in terms of time served, and that's prison. So we don't want to think of just keeping kids in school. We want to think of preparing the youth for tomorrow. Now, on that front, we think of schooling as the gateway to opportunity. But so far, the ramp up which they're walking to prepare themselves has just been too shallow for really the schooling they're doing to prepare them for the opportunities. So now we're to the brutal bad news that you've probably heard, but I'm going to emphasize just how bad it is. There is a standard for what the first world is in terms of education. there's an examination that nearly all OECD countries participate in called the PISA, and it's an assessment of what children are able to do. It's not just rote learning, it's actually the ability to apply knowledge. And in the most recent round of that assessment, Peru finished last. Just last. Now, to some extent, that represents Peru's courage to do it. Because there's lots of places in the world that I work on that have much worse education systems than Peru, but they don't have the courage to take the exam. So on one level, you want to compliment the Peruvian government for not just dropping out. They could call their colleagues from the Dominican Republic that came in of them worse the time before but dropped out and didn't take it again. But on this scale that scales sort of arbitrarily to the OECD average being 500, Peru was at 368 on mathematics, and similarly low scores for the assessments of reading and science. Now, what does 368 mean? Well, in the country I'm from, the United States, we're at about 500. We're actually a pretty typical OECD country, and we're obsessed with being like Korea, that's 50 points ahead. So the problem is that Peru is almost 50 points behind Chile, which is 30 points almost behind Turkey, which is 40 points behind Denmark, which is behind Vietnam, which is 50 points behind Korea. So in order to become a first world country, Peru really has to think about a complete transformation to achieve assessment more like 500. And by the way, the poor performance of Peruvian education isn't just limited to the fact that the bottom is very low. It's also the case that the top is very low. So, sometimes people think, oh, yes, we have problems with schooling, the kids out in the jungle or in rudimentary facilities and aren't learning very much. That's not Peru's problem. Peru's problem is the whole distribution of learning is too low. So if you look at the percent of Peruvian children that are in roughly the global top 10% on mathematics performance, and the global top 10% isn't being like a superstar physicist like Einstein, it's just kind of having the capability you need to participate in a modern technical economy. The people of the top 10% are going to be the engineers, they're going to be the entrepreneurs, they're going to be, hopefully, at least some of them, the political leaders. But if you ask yourself, how many children a year in Peru arrive at age 15 in the global top 10%? Well, in Peru, only 0.6% are in the top 10%, versus 1.6 in Chile, 5.9, even the USA, which lags in many dimensions on mathematics performance. Now, what that translates into is that each year there's only 3,200 kids in this entire country that are in the global 10%. So think of what Ricardo Hausmann was talking about yesterday, about the capabilities and knowledge you need for the structural transformation to make Peru a prosperous economy. Can you really imagine doing that with only 3,000 students a year in the global top 10%? That's barely one good entering class of one small university. We could literally probably put every child in Peru of a given year that's in that thing in this room if we packed them really tight. As opposed to Korea, which produces 200,000 students a year above that level. And even the US, and as a US citizen, I can tell you, the typical American 15-year-old is not a very impressive person. Unless video games count as a skill that you value. But even in the US, which underperforms most OECD countries, just by sheer mass, we produce 320,000. So imagine that you're recruiting the team for a global mundial of economic performance, and all you've got to recruit from is a base of 3,000. It's just impossible. So I want to emphasize that the problem isn't just in the selva. The problem is also in Lima, that not only are we not getting enough students passing a minimal threshold, we're also not getting enough students at the top. So, unfortunately, for Peru and its future, while it's done well at expanding the quantity of education, but lagged on the quality, empirical studies that relate economic growth to education find it's not schooling that matters. It's the quality of schooling that matters. So when you look at the relationship between quantity of schooling and output, it's actually quite weak. But if you look at the relationship between, and I apologize for the graph, but Peru sits very low on the scores and has correspondingly had lagging growth. And if you look at the countries that have really had high growth performance, nearly all of them are also countries that have had high levels of quality of schooling. So what would it take? And I thought it was interesting in the survey that they asked the question of when could Peru really be a first world country? Well, let's think about what it would take for Peru to arrive at first world status of a score of roughly 500 in education. Well, unfortunately, if we extrapolate business as usual of either recent Peruvian progress or of the typical progress of a country, if you look at the typical progress that's happening around the world, it's about 1 point a year, right? So if Peru were to just continue business as usual on the quality front, and even achieved, which by the way, recently on some of the subjects, Peru's done very well, but on many subjects they've been less than 1 point a year. But even say they achieved kind of the average performance of 1 point a year. Well, I hope in this room the math's pretty simple. If you're 132 points from 500 and you make progress at 1 point a year, it's going to be a long damn time before Peru reaches first world status. You can maybe think about not your child, not their children, but the great-great-great-great-grandchildren would be first world status on education, and that's not a future I'm sure anyone in this room wants to see. So what we need to think about is accelerating the pace of progress. How do we have a pretty substantial acceleration? Now, it's also the case that no country in the world has leaps forward in education. Education is a cumulative process. Children learn bit by year by year. You improve the system bit by year by year. About 10 countries in the world, of the 70 that are tested, achieve rates of 4 points a year. 4 points a year roughly would get Peru to first world status in a generation. You could, in 30 years, at 4 points a year, roughly close on first world status. So if you want to take seriously the goal of Peru being a first world country, and you want to see it in some of your lifetimes, some of you are a little viejo para think 30 years, but 30, not my lifetime. But if you want to see it in your children's lifetime, let's say, you've got to get to 4 points a year. That's going to require a substantial acceleration in the pace of progress. But what you don't want to get into is this area of wishful thinking. You're not going to do it at 10 points a year. That's not how education systems work. But I really do think it would be an audacious and bold goal for Peru to think about getting to first world status in a generation. Now, what would that take? Oops, went too far. Well, there's various metaphors for an education system. One is an elephant. It's huge. Education systems are huge. There's literally, tens of thousands of schools, hundreds of thousands of teachers. That kind of system has an enormous amount of momentum. So I think of it as a giant ocean cargo. It can turn, but it can't turn very fast. But it can make the pivot from the momentum that Peru has had mainly to expand enrollment and mainly around inputs into a real performance focus on learning and expanding capability of students. So there's going to have to be a pivot of the attention of the system from the past goals of expansion to the current goals of improvement of quality. Now, the first thing about that is that it would be wonderful, and I would love it, everyone would love it, if that could be done just by increasing spending. But it can't. There's been literally thousands of empirical studies between the connection between inputs and outcomes. And while inputs do play some role in steepening the learning profile, and while a certain level of inputs and quality of the infrastructure of schooling is just a fundamental aspect of human decency, so I'm not disparaging investments, a spending plan is only part of a learning plan. There's lots of countries around the world that spend incredibly more money per student than Peru spends and still don't have quality education. So I'm not disparaging the importance of a spending plan, but I am saying you want a spending plan embedded in a learning plan because it's only going to be part of what's needed. Peru is both going to need to spend more and spend better to get to first world status in a generation. The difficulty and the risk of being focused on an input plan is the risk that these two snakes look a lot alike. Now, why am I showing you a picture of two snakes? Well, one of these snakes is deadly poisonous. One of these snakes is completely harmless. But one of these snakes is smarter because it realizes that if there's a poisonous snake in my ecosystem, I can achieve all of the benefits of being poisonous without all the bother. Fangs, who needs them? Venom, who needs it? As long as I look enough like a poisonous snake, people will avoid me. My predators will avoid me. So this is a phenomena that we call isomorphic mimicry, that unfortunately you can often get nearly all of the benefit of being the legitimacy of being a good schooling system just by looking like a good schooling system. You can have impressive looking buildings. You can have teachers that have impressive credentials. But unless you're in fact performance focused, all of that can be a charade. Can be like a Hollywood set where the exterior looks really impressive, but inside it's hollow. So the important thing about the pivot to learning is to not fall into the trap of isomorphic mimicry, is to not say our goal is to do the things that other high-performance systems do. Your goal is to do what other high-performing systems do. And there's a huge difference, and education systems have coasted essentially on the legitimation of isomorphic mimicry for decades. So as long as people were doing things that looked like what a schooling system would do, people were complacent about the actual performance inside the building, and that produced a generation of children that didn't get the education they needed. So rather than talk about actual concrete means of getting to quality education, I want to step back and say, what's the system, what's the design of the system that would produce the outcomes we want as the natural operation of the pressures created in the system? So rather than tell you exactly what you should do, I want to step back and say, if what we want to happen isn't happening, we need to think a step deeper than we'll just do it. You want to ask yourself, what's the ecosystem in which isomorphic mimicry, just imitating performance of others, is actually an optimal organizational strategy. So if you think of the system characteristics, if you're operating in a system that's closed to novelty, that lots of new things aren't tried, and if novelty, any proposed innovation, is judged merely by its conformity with an existing agenda, then you're going to be in a system in which it's actually the correct strategy of the organization to be a mimic. Why? Because if you tried to move to demonstrated success as your organizational strategy, but you lived in an ecosystem where there was no true evaluation of functionality, you wouldn't be rewarded as an organization. You would actually risk your legitimacy because you would look odd and there would be no way to justify what you're doing. So if you think about what an education leadership needs to do, they not only need to drive their organization towards demonstrated success, they need to worry about creating the ecosystem in which demonstrated success is the correct organizational strategy of every organization in the system. Now, I think as businessmen, you understand this. Because after all, the essence of business in a competitive environment is you have a metric of demonstrated functionality. Will people buy my product? Right? And can I make profits selling my product to an avid customer base? And the market is open. So the reason why the market can produce spectacular results is it creates an ecosystem in which organizations have to have demonstrated success to survive, and hence encourages the leadership of organizations, people in this room, to push their organizations towards demonstrated success as the strategy of your firm, right? You're accountable for a bottom line. So this is not to push that analogy, but what we need in order for the educational leadership from top to bottom and teachers to pull this direction, we need to pull the system away from a system in which merely relying on looking like an appropriate school is enough to satisfy. So what would a system like that look like? Well, I characterize systems drawing on some private sector consultants who use the metaphor of spiders versus starfish. Now, what is that metaphor? Well, the fundamental aspect of that metaphor is between systems that are centralized, because with a spider, he might have an enormous web, but the thinking only happens in one place. The web merely exists to transfer information to the spider, who attempts to make all the decisions and allocate all the system resources and move and dictate what goes on in the entire web. On the other hand, a starfish system is a very interesting creature, because a starfish has no brain. Now, you might think, how does an organism exist without a brain? Well, when a starfish moves, it's not because the starfish had a brain that decided to move. It moved because it's a loose coalition of thousands of tentacles, and the tentacles on one side of the starfish were pulling towards food or towards something attractive in one direction more than the tentacles on the other side were pulling against it. So the movement of the starfish is the result of the bottom-up pressures rather than being driven from top down. So, now that said, starfish systems can be completely disorganized and chaotic. And spider systems, when they work well, can be tremendously productive. So what I want to ask is, what are the characteristics, what are the principles that would be embedded in order to create a starfish system that can generate the innovation and pressure for performance that it will take to transform Peru's education system from a focus on inputs and enrollments to a focus and achievement in learning outcomes? And I believe there are 6 characteristics that will characterize a successful starfish system. The first is that it's open. You need entry and exit. You need easier time for people with new ideas to be able to get enough of a foothold into the system that their ideas can be tried out. Again, the market doesn't survive and thrive because existing firms learn. It also survives and thrives because new entrants come in and they come with new ideas. So a market with no entry and exit is a group of monopolists that wouldn't guarantee progress. So the first characteristic is it needs to be more open. The second characteristic is that the intrinsic nature of the process of an education requires that teachers and students have a close and productive relationship. That means that schools need to be locally operated. They can be owned in lots of ways, but you have to have a lot of flexible autonomy at the local school level, right? They can be provided, well, we can come back to that. The third thing is the system needs to be performance pressured. Now, I don't mean by that we should create one test or two tests and try and drive the system in a high-stakes way by that test. But what that does mean is there has to be a set of standards, a set of goals, a set of vision of where the education system wants to go, and then progress against that needs to be measured, and all the actors in the system need to understand that the purpose of the system is performance, right? So we want organizations with internal norms of a drive to succeed. You really want organizations that understand and pursue the goals and are performance-driven. The fifth characteristic of a starfish system that would work is fourth. A little embarrassing arithmetic mistake there, huh? The fourth characteristic is that you want the starfish system to be professionally networked. It really is very helpful to teachers to talk to other teachers. But it's professionally networked, not hierarchically networked. That is, lots of peer-to-peer opportunities for learning and transmission of better practices, better transmission of performance norms, but vertically oriented connections of teachers can often be counterproductive. So it's professionally networked. The fifth is that the system needs to be technically supported. You can't just set up a performance goal, endow the organization with autonomy, and expect them to succeed. They actually have to have sources of support such that they can learn how to achieve the performance that's expected of them. I often debate the importance of motivation versus support with a friend of mine, and he came up with a brilliant analogy. He said, no matter how much pressure you put on people, if they don't know how to do it, they don't know how to do it. So he says, imagine you took a room of nuclear scientists and you locked them in a room with the appropriate materials to build a nuclear bomb and said, at the end of the year, I'm going to let you out of the room, and if there's not a nuclear bomb, I'm going to shoot you. Highest stakes, highest motivation possible. At the end of the year, you might have a nuclear bomb, right? If you took a dozen economists and put them in the room with the right materials for a nuclear bomb and said, at the end of the year, I'm going to shoot you if there's not a nuclear bomb, you would have a dozen dead economists. We just wouldn't have the capability we don't have the expertise. So you want to combine pressure with support, right? Support alone will often not work because you haven't communicated the performance pressure, but by the same token, pressure alone won't work unless you actually are able to provide them the support they need to technically. The last characteristic of a starfish system is it has to be flexibly financed. Unless the people operating at the local level have sufficient control over the funding, they just can't possibly respond. They can't be innovative. They can't respond to the local conditions. They can't be part of an effective system. Now, This is in direct contrast, almost point by point, to, and I'm not an expert at all in the Peruvian education system, but most education systems around the world that I have worked closely with are classical spiders, and once spiders become dysfunctional, the whole web is worthless. The problem with a spider system is that by being concentrated, it might be efficient when it works, but if you kill the spider, the whole web is worthless. The nice thing about a starfish system is that if you cut a starfish into 5 pieces, you know what you get? 5 starfish. A starfish system is more robust. But what a spider system does is, when it can achieve it, is it's closed. Any innovation has to come from the top. There's not a lot of openness to new entrants, and no school ever closes. One of the rules of running an education system is no school ever closes. So you can't have, in a spider system, the dynamism you need. In a spider system, key decisions are all made centrally. So you have to rely on the one brain at the center, and they just can't possibly process and make the decisions that need to be made at the local level with the discretion that need to be made. Third is most spider systems, rather than being performance-driven, are compliance-driven. That is, what you communicate to the participants in the system from top to bottom is not, here's our goals, help us achieve them. You communicate, here are the rules, follow them. Once you do that, you've completely deflated the ability of the system to be more than the sum of its parts. In a spider system, when teachers organize, they organize vertically as a bargaining mechanism rather than horizontally as professionals. So, you can talk a lot about the damage that teachers' unions might do, but they're not the problem. The vertical-oriented teachers' union is the result and consequence of a vertically oriented spider system. And you can't ask, in some sense, the teachers to give up a vertically orientation of themselves as long as the whole system is vertically oriented. Again, the system they interact with is already vertically oriented. Finally, or on the last 2 things, in a spider system, the hierarchy is not seen as providing support. It's seen as providing discipline and supervision. And that's just not the attitude that produces quality schooling. You can't supervise. You can supervise people into compliance, but you have to support people into performance. Finally, most budgets are tied to specific inputs from top to bottom. And if the budget's completely tied, it doesn't matter what rhetoric you have about decentralization. Ultimately, people just don't have a chance. So now, I think, and I'm sure the minister will talk more about the ways in which Peru is moving, but Peru has started moving towards creating the characteristics that can result in a functional spider system. So for instance, they have already articulated clear standards of what children should know at grade 2, and they have started a world-class censal evaluation of what the performance is. Now, this takes courage, because what these performance pressure evaluation systems will first reveal is failure. So if you look, the mathematics, the percent of students that are graded as adequate on mathematics in these evaluations was hovering sort of less than 15%. Now, to some extent, you need support to push through this, right? The cowardly response to this is to never do the evaluation again. But if you do that, you've lost all the momentum of having created a performance-oriented system. So now, the reason I use the metaphor of starfish is that there's lots of species of starfish. These are broad principles that have many instantiations. There's many ways to achieve a high-performance starfish system. So no one should come to Peru, and particularly not a gringo, and say this is the ideal system for Peru, right? The ideal system for Peru will be created in Peru by Peruvians. But the question is, how do we get these principles of high-performance systems embodied in the realities of Peru? That's the hard question to face, and there's lots of ways to do it. You can do it with local control, with higher levels of supervision and support. You can do it with charter schools inside the public sector. You can do it with community, with larger degrees of community control. You can do it with markets. But markets aren't the answer. And I know that's a little bit tough for this audience, but just turning it over to markets in the management of schools is part of a move to a starfish system, not the move itself. If you turn control and open it up to the private sector without enabling the other conditions of an effective starfish system, you won't necessarily drive towards higher performance. I think your recent experience and your attitudes in this survey between opening up the tertiary sector reveals that merely open entry is only one of the characteristics of an effective spider system. So, I'm an economist. I love the private sector. I love free markets. And again, let me just emphasize that. It's like my wife thinks my true religion is being an economist. So I love markets. I love the private sector. But I am also an empiricist, and I can show you that merely the introduction of private participants without embedded in an overall driven performance starfish system will not be the answer to a high-performing system in Peru. That said, let me repeat, I love markets. I love the private sector. Once a starfish system is being enabled, it will be easy to fit private participants into that system in a productive way. But the first step isn't just allowing private entry. I think we can, I know I'm emphasizing this because I'm pushing back a little bit against, I think, the instincts of this audience, but with the sense that you're hearing this from a friend, right? I'm not in love with the state. I'm not in love with state education. I think it's been disastrous in many respects in many countries, but you have to fix the system before you can slot in the players. So let me just emphasize 3 things I'm not saying. The first thing I'm not saying is privatization is a panacea. I've found as an economist that when my mouth moves, educators hear markets, 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 no matter what I say. I'm not saying that. I'm saying starfish systems, which are complex organisms that have to be created. That said, I'm also not saying bottom up. I'm not saying decentralization. Decentralization is not a panacea, as you've experienced in Peru. Decentralization can be part of a strategic starfish system, but you need to retain core parts of the functions of a starfish system at very high levels. So to be performance driven, somebody needs to set performance standards, somebody needs to measure performance standards, and we all know you can't have the referee and the player be the same person. That just doesn't work. And I'm not saying high stakes testing. I'm saying performance pressure around a coherent set of visions of what Peruvian education should mean, and then push in all mechanisms for that performance vision to be realized. That will include rigorous testing, no question about it. But it doesn't turn into merely high-stakes testing. Finally, where to start? I've set out a set of principles that sort of articulate a vision for how Peru might be able to accelerate its performance from the business as usual at most 1 point a year to the 4 points or more a year you need to be first world in a generation. That said, I'm a big believer in what I call strategic incrementalism. You want to have a vision and then start doing the things that are doable now that put you on a path to that vision. Big bang reform mostly produces big bang. Often there's no reform. So you have to move from the only useful map takes you from where you are to where you want to be. Just telling you where you want to be isn't very useful. The second thing I want to emphasize about where to start is you can't beat a turtle to move. Turtles have survived because they have a very hard shell. And if there's a turtle and you wanted to get it to go somewhere and you decide you're going to drive it like you drive a mule by hitting it with a stick, what will happen? The turtle will pull inside its strong defensive shell. It will wait you out. You will get tired of beating on the turtle well before the turtle gets tired of being hit. So you need the education system to stick its neck out. So purely external attacks on the education system will not produce a high-quality education system. No one has ever produced a high-quality education system by beating the teachers into submission. That's not the vision. You have to get the people inside the education system together with the civil society, together with the private sector, to have a common vision. And people inside that system have to cooperate with you, and they're going to have to stick their neck out. And if they perceive that the external environment is just a stick trying to beat them, they're not going to stick their neck out, and you're not going to get cooperation. So you need large parts of the system that are there waiting for their talents to be unleashed in the entrance of performance goals. You've got to get them to work with you. If it turns into a merely beating of the turtle, you will have a long and frustrating relationship with education. So the final thing, since I am in favor of the private sector, is I have a book. You can buy it. And everything I've said is detailed in much more detail there. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Lant Pritchett. Y hemos comenzado con toda una propuesta interesante, Estrellas de Mar. Interesante.